let's get started then. So good afternoon to everybody on this, for me, beautiful sunny day. It's the second Reverse Rett Bitesize, which we're all really excited about. Last one was phenomenal and we had such an amazing response. Thank you all for signing up. As I said at the beginning, some of you may not have been in for that. We had 84 people sign up for this Bitesize, so it's really encouraging that you're all so interested in the news that Rachel's going to share with you. So today's session is the second one on emerging gene therapies. We are going to be holding these bite-sized sessions every month, and right through until June 2024. November's session will have Dan Lumsden from the Everline Clinic as the guest speaker, which is lovely. It takes the pressure off of all of us. We are recording today's session, so if any of you don't want to be in the recording, then feel free to turn your cameras off. For the few seconds I'm going to ask you to do this, can you all turn your cameras on just for security purposes? Okay, there we go. That's lovely to see all your beautiful faces. If you also could mute yourself, because we're going to be recording this, so we want the quality to be as good as we possibly can, because we will be sharing it with the community probably early next week. Throughout the session, I'm going to be collating any questions that you have. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screens, and if you have any questions, then just pop them in there. Alternatively, we can do either an electronic hands up, if those of you who know how to do that. I always get the wrong one. But if not, just put your hand up and we'll come to you. But we're going to try and sort of do questions as each section kind of comes to an end, or we'll hold any right till the end. So it's entirely up to you how you want to deal with questions. And sorry, I didn't even introduce myself. I just realized that. My name is Catherine. And I am the operations manager at Reverse Rett. Some of you I know, some of you I've climbed mountains with. Hello, Louise. And some of you I'm hoping to meet at the gala early next month. So I'm going to hand over to Rachael now, the CEO of Reverse Rett, and everyone enjoy the session. Over to you, Rachael.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see everyone here, and welcome to this second bite-sized session about emerging gene therapies and Rett syndrome. I'm Rachael Stevenson, co-founder and CEO of Reverse Rett, but above all, I am the mother of Amber, who is 28 and has Rett syndrome, and stepmom of Beth, who is 23 and also has Rett syndrome. And Catherine also has a daughter, Georgina, who has Rett syndrome. Leslie, could you put our slide up with our girls on, please? Okay, so we started these emerging therapies bite-sized sessions back in September, and we plan to hold them monthly now until next June. And the reason that we really started them is because we know that families and friends and caregivers of people with Rett syndrome have a lot of questions at this time. Even though it's an exciting time, it's full of uncertainty about how things are going to unfold as the gene therapy clinical trials progress. So we're going to have these sessions where, and we will instruct this as well to all the lovely people that are going to come on and present to us, we want them to be in plain English. We don't want them to be overly scientific. We want people to be able to have information in an accessible format. So for me, that means that obviously I'm not a doctor or a scientist. And so as I go through and explain some of the things in this session, I have to oversimplify sometimes. If you want to hear more detailed information that is more scientific, we are going to be sharing resources from the Association of Gene and Cell Therapy and from RSRT, the Rett Syndrome Research Trust in the States. And there's a lot of good up-to-date information that's more complex on both of those websites and on their YouTube channels. Okay, so as I said, although I'm not a doctor or a scientist, I have been doing this work now for 14 years. and hopefully have learned some stuff on the way, which hopefully I will be able to convey to you as we move through the information today about how the field has progressed and where we're going next. Okay, next slide, please, Wesley. If as we go along, anyone has a burning question that they feel needs to be answered before they can absorb any more information, please ask the question. I don't want to lose people and you have to wait till the end to have things clarified. So in the last session that we did in September, we really did a basic overview of gene therapy and how it works in terms of addressing the underlying cause of Rett syndrome. And we touched on some of the differences between the two current gene therapy trials and where they are up to. So in today's session, we're going to talk about how the gene therapy clinical trials will work, how protocols are determined, and what some of the challenges are. We're going to take a deeper dive into the inclusion and exclusion criteria and explain how those decisions are made about who's included in a trial and who isn't. But specifically, we'll look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the Taysha adults trial that's taking place in Canada and for the Neurogene children's trial that is due to start in the US. And I think going into the details about those trials will give everybody a better understanding about who's able to take part and why. Okay, so originally when we'd been designing these sessions, I had thought today that we would look at the processes involved in getting these therapies approved once the trials have shown that they're effective. Okay, but once I started working on the presentation, I realized we probably wouldn't have time to go into that today. That's probably at least another half an hour on the end. So we will come back to regulatory approvals later on. But for today, I think the important thing to cover is just to properly explore how the trials work and how these two in particular are proceeding at this time. So as Catherine said, at the end, we'll take questions, but we'll also at the end review the next milestones to look for as we move into the last part of 2023 and into next year. So obviously we're all in hopeful times in the Rett community worldwide. We have one gene therapy clinical trial for adults underway in Canada. We have 2 gene therapy trials in children which have been given the green light by the US FDA. I think I just want to emphasize here that as a parent myself, I know the urgency that families can feel when they hear news like a company has been given the green light to go ahead, or that they've received some kind of special designation, which is supposed to mean that things happen faster. Okay, and then often what happens is we don't hear anything for a really extended period of time. So I think also the other thing is there can be a lot of confusion about what the different designations mean. And it will be helpful for us today to try and understand what some of the milestones mean, which will give us a more realistic view of the kind of timelines that we're looking at. Okay, but first, I think just to give us the overall contextual information, the background information about gene therapy trials, I want to show a short film from ASGCT, which explains how gene therapy clinical trials work. And it's only 4 minutes, so stay tuned. Okay, before I go ahead, if you have not had a look at the ASGCT website or YouTube, and you would like to learn a lot more, please do have a look. We'll put the links in our show notes after this presentation today. I've taken the liberty of drawing some of the information for some of the later slides from an ASGCT presentation, which I'll reference later on as well. Okay, go ahead, Wesley.
There are currently hundreds of different types of gene therapies in clinical trials. The potential for therapies is vast, since almost any gene in the human genome can be altered to treat a specific disease. But let's take a step back. What even is a clinical trial, and why is it so important? Clinical trials study the way a drug or treatment will interact with the human body, and whether a drug is safe and effective. A couple things happen before a clinical trial starts. The treatment is tested in both test tubes and animals. This step of the process is called a preclinical study. These studies check if the treatment will work and how much of it is needed to see a positive effect. It also checks the safety, looking for any negative effects. If the preclinical results are promising, the researcher then designs the study for humans. The researcher decides things like how many people will be part of the study or how a treatment will be administered to patients. Every trial has unique guidelines for who can participate in the study. Here to explain more is Dr. Adora Endu.
These guidelines are called eligibility criteria and are really characteristics participants should have. They typically include things such as age, gender, medical history, and many other characteristics. And this really is to make sure that the volunteers meet the criteria so that researchers should understand the results of the clinical trial.
The researcher submits an investigational new drug application to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, referred to as the FDA. They review how the treatment is made, preclinical data, and the clinical trial design to make sure the researcher has done everything possible to minimize risks to the volunteers. Once the FDA agrees that risks to volunteers are minimized, it's put into action. Trials are conducted in phases, with every phase modified to help answer a different question to better understand the treatment. If a study is not deemed safe, it will not move on to the next phase. Safety is a priority in each and every phase. This includes monitoring for adverse events, which are any undesirable experiences. The researcher collects information on how the event relates to the treatment, the severity, frequency, and how to resolve it. In turn, these become the expected side effects to be aware of. Phase 1 tests if the treatment is safe for a smaller number of patients. Sometimes it also can determine the right dosage for patients. Phase 2 expands the number of patients receiving the therapy and determines if the responses to the therapy are favorable or useful, while still monitoring safety. The treatment then enters Phase 3, which typically lasts the longest. In this phase, the main goal is to prove that the treatment produces the desired result while being safe in an even larger group of patients. If a treatment is being studied for a rare disease or one that has an unmet medical need, some phases can be combined to make the evaluation process more efficient. After the clinical trial, a marketing application is submitted and the FDA makes a final decision about whether the treatment will be approved to use. The whole process from clinical trials to approval can take 8 years or more. However, the FDA has various ways to accelerate the process for some therapies, which has decreased it to as few as 5 years in some instances. The time it takes to research and move through the approvals process is necessary to properly develop safe and effective treatments for patients. For more information on gene therapy clinical trials, visit asgct.org.
Okay. So that was a good overview of the process of bringing a clinical trial, of bringing a treatment into clinical trials. Okay, but it's obviously specific to the US, talking about FDA applications and FDA approvals. So on the next slide, you can see here that the regulatory process here is similar, but the terminology that's used is different. Okay. So I've made a lovely slide that Wesley's getting put up here now because it's very confusing with all the different acronyms. So we're breaking them down and showing you where they align. So for example, in the US, when they refer to the FDA, we have a regulator here that's called MHRA. In Europe, there's the EMA. And in Canada, there's Health Canada. Okay, so in that video, obviously, they're making the assumption that it's all things that are happening in America, but here it follows the same kind of process, okay? So in the States, when they get an approval for, or they put in an application for a clinical trial, it's called an IND application, investigational new drug. But when it's being put in here to the MHRA or in Europe, it's a trial application. So that can be confusing. Sometimes people can think they're not quite sure what's happening when. And then there's also all the orphan designations and fast track designations and things like that, that basically we can break down, or you can just say, these are all things that incentivize companies to work on rare diseases, because obviously there's not a lot of incentives in terms of number of patients. You know, if you're making a drug for a disease, what you really want is as many people as possible to buy it. Okay, so if when governments give incentives to companies for developing rare disease drugs, they do things like give them marketing access that's exclusive to them for an extended period of time, or they give them, you know, subsidize, or they fast track applications. Okay, so as I said, this table makes it all crystal clear. Hopefully, you've got the countries across the top, and then at the side you've got the regulator, the kind of application that's referred to if a clinical trial is being applied for, and then all the sorts of special designations that are there to speed up programs for serious conditions. And these are typically for conditions with an unmet medical need, which Rett syndrome is, as we've no approved drugs in this country. Okay, so the next slide just gives you the links to the information from the different regulators in the different countries, so that if you want to see more information, that's where you can find it. Okay, so rolling on to the next slide, please. I thought it'd be helpful to show a slide with a timeline of the pathway to approval for the Taysha clinical trial. Okay, so this is just regulatory milestones now. And people who've been around for a few years will recognize that we get these kinds of announcements that pop up and everyone feels quite happy about them. And then sometimes things go quiet and it feels like things aren't really moving forward and we don't really know what's happening. Now, there can be cases where that goes wrong, and we have had that in Rett syndrome, but more often than not, things are progressing. So they're just things that are progressing, but that aren't necessarily newsworthy from an investor relations point of view, or they're not really predictable stepping stones that would be helpful for families to know about, or within the control of the company involved. Okay, so sometimes they're about goings on with the hospitals that are going to be involved in clinical trials and other kinds of bureaucracy. So in that space between a company receiving the green light from a regulator, so that would be in the States IND approval to proceed with their clinical trial, but whether it's, you know, the States, Europe, Health Canada, MHRA, we might not hear anything for quite a long time after that approval happens. So as you can see on this slide, we've got the clearance from Health Canada, which happened in the first quarter of 2022, and then nothing happened for quite a while. Wesley, pop the next slide up for me. And yeah, and so here you can see things start to happen. Okay, so 2021, you get orphan drug designations from here and other side of the Atlantic. Then you get the clinical trial application clearance from Health Canada. And then the first patient is not dosed for a year later. So things felt quite spread out for a while. And it seems like in that space, we've no idea what's actually happening. Okay. Please go to the next slide, Wesley. So as I mentioned, we need to talk about Neurogene. So Neurogene, as you can see at this point, these are not regulatory milestones, because apart from the one FDA clearance of the IND in 2023, apart from that, we don't have any further information. They are, as a company, less keen to share things as they go along. But also, we don't know some of the things that have happened, and it could be the case that they have crossed certain milestones that we don't know about. But you can see, again, it's sort of wider gaps. And I think certainly for this year, 2023, when we heard about the FDA IND clearance earlier this year, I think people, you know, especially for drug trials, typically things move a bit faster. But for gene therapy trials, it's taking a bit longer to get them into to actually starting. And So I would like to be able to talk to you a little bit about what might be happening in the spaces in between. As I mentioned earlier, I've pulled some of the information from ASGCT resources, okay? And one of the videos that I've pulled some of the info from the following slides from is called What to Expect as a Participant in a Gene Therapy Clinical Trial. So this video was originally shown in May 2022 at the ASGCT annual conference in Washington, DC. It is about 3 hours and 30 minutes long. So what I've done is pulled out the pieces that I think are helpful and condensed them and made them relevant to Rett syndrome. And these are specifically bits from the presentations of a person called Megan Waldrop, MD, and Heather Lau, MD. So thank you to them, and thank you to ASGCT for being such a great resource. Slide, please, Wesley. Okay, so hypothetically speaking, these are some of the things that are likely to be happening when a gene therapy trial is due to start, but we're not really hearing much. So obviously for a gene therapy clinical trial in Rett syndrome, you need a doctor who's an expert in Rett syndrome, and you also need a doctor who's an expert in gene therapy, and those things are quite obvious, but you also need specialty doctors from other areas. So you might need people from immunology, from hepatology, so that they can find out, about how the study is affecting the person's liver, or give that kind of input that's needed. You need anesthetic for both for dosing patients, but also for some of the screenings and the follow-up visits. So you're going to need to bring an anesthetist in, and perhaps a team. Okay, safety assessments, typically bloods and urine, or even in this case, samples of cerebrospinal fluid. You need to get these done. Where will they be done? Can they all be measured on site or off site? Does the hospital use different hospitals do different things? Some of them have to outsource lab work like this. So where's that going to be done? And then it's also about coordinating different elements of the screening. So for the overall screening, in some clinical trials, you can get everything done in the same day at the same location. But perhaps for these clinical trials, because much more is required, you need to bring in MRIs or EEGs and perhaps tests of somebody's mobility. Things like that might all happen in different places around the hospital site or in different hospitals. Okay, so it's coordinating that, how can it happen hypothetically for everybody, and then individually arranging it patient by patient. So there's also a lot of working out who's coordinating all this stuff. Often people have to be hired in to do the clinical trial coordination piece specifically for a trial that's this complex. Okay, and so the other thing that's quite important is the pharmacy cover. So where and how the product's going to be stored, how long does it stay stable? You might remember when we had COVID, the vaccines first came out, one of them had to be frozen and you could only get a certain amount out at a time. So there might be considerations like that. How will it be transported to the patient? So say you've got the patient prepared for the procedure, so they're under general anesthetic and they're ready to go. At what point does the pharmacy release the medication? Because typically they'll hold it, especially for clinical trials, they have to have really tight procedures for how, making sure that everywhere that the clinical trial is done and with every patient, everything's exactly the same for reasons that we'll go into it a bit more in a little while. So how do you physically get it to the patient? So when I've seen the gene therapy for Rett syndrome, they're in a little vial that big. So does somebody carry it? Who carries it? I would like to think it goes on one of these little cushions like wedding rings or something, but I don't know. But it needs, all that has to be spelled out. And do the pharmacy staff need training, additional training? And then you've got things like, that's not on the slide, like the most important thing about a clinical trial is making sure that there's integrity of the data that are gathered. And who's doing the data monitoring? Do they need training? Is it done with certain equipment? How do you measure certain things? What's happening with the long-term monitoring that's going to need to happen? And in some cases that goes on for 10 years with gene therapy trials. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the things that we did at Reverse Rett in anticipation of the gene therapy trials starting, and we didn't know if we would get any in the UK or not, and fingers crossed, we don't know yet for sure that we will. But in anticipation of gene therapy trials, we ran a number of what we called emerging therapies readiness groups. And these were small online groups of Rett families that had children and adults with Rett syndrome of different ages. And because we wanted to better understand as a patient group what some of the questions were that people had about taking part in a trial, whether they had, what their worries were basically, and if there would be anything that would get in the way of them taking part. Some of the questions really surprised us. So, for instance, people would ask, do you have to pay to take part in a clinical trial? And everyone wants to know what the risks are. But we found that adult parents were quicker to say, yeah, I think it's something we would do, than parents of younger children. However, one question that everybody had was, how is the selection made about who can take part? And that's where we come to discussing eligibility criteria. So what's eligibility criteria and how is it determined? Well, no, Wesley, go back. Thank you. I think this is a really good description, and it's taken from this, which I think is a book. The eligibility criteria are created to limit the variability. So making sure that the group is as similar as possible, to control for confounding factors, which is science speak for, to make sure that there's nothing that confuses the results, to maximize the probability of detecting a treatment effect if one exists. So getting this group that are as similar as possible, making sure that there's a limited amount of things that could mix up the results, so that you've got the best possible chance of seeing a difference because of the treatment, if there is a difference. Okay, next slide, please. So eligibility criteria is just a list of criteria to specify the population that should be studied, and it needs to be sufficiently narrow to minimize noise, masking treatment effect. And so what you would do there is you'd make sure things like noise would be something like, if the person has a lot of seizures, for example, you wouldn't know, are those seizures caused by this treatment? Is it a serious adverse event related to the treatment, or is it something that would have happened anyway? So you'd get people who are more stable. You wouldn't want somebody to go on another drug at the same time as starting a gene therapy trial, because how would you know if it was the drug that was helping them or this gene therapy trial? Okay, so that's what that means. And then sufficiently broad to allow generalization of study results. So if you only did it, say we only did it in patients that have retained speech in Rett syndrome, and then they came out and could speak really well, that doesn't necessarily represent the rest of the population of people with Rett syndrome. And indeed, you wouldn't be able to say that it could. Okay. Must allow for feasible recruitment of subjects into their trial. Say we knew there was a group of patients with Rett syndrome with X mutation, and those patients were all really stable, and all the course of the disease progresses in exactly the same way for all of them, regardless, okay, of where they were born or their background or anything else. And then we decided to do the clinical trial with them because they were the most similar group possible and with the least amount of variables. Okay, and let's throw in that none of them have any seizures as well. Okay. But because it's a rare mutation, there's only 1% of the population of people with Rett syndrome have this. So therefore, you wouldn't be able to recruit enough of them into the study to make the study work. Okay. And so the idea is that all of these things together give you the greatest chance of detecting that difference between people who have had the medicine and people who haven't had the medicine that are typically in a control group. Okay, so now we are going to look at the criteria, at the eligibility criteria for the TAISHA adults trial. Okay, so just a generally overview about the TAISHA adults trial. Okay. It's taking place in Canada, as we know. It's for people over the age of 18. An amendment has been submitted to lower the age to 15, and I think that has been permission to go ahead, apart from we have to wait until that third patient has been dosed, I think. Okay, so it's a phase 1 and 2 open label dose escalation study. So I'm going to break that down. Okay, phase 1 and 2, you'll remember from that video that we watched, phase 1 is primarily focused usually on safety and tolerability, whether or not the patient can cope with what's happening to them in the trial, or as a result of the therapy that they've received. Phase 2 is typically to look at efficacy, but in a study like gene therapy trials, which are so invasive and also typically taking place in populations with this unmet need, where there's a serious condition for which there's no other treatment, the stages are sometimes wrapped together. And also because in rare diseases, we have a small number of patients as well. So it's really difficult to go, let's have this small group do this, let's have this small group do this, and then have another. It's better to just do it all at once. So they bring those two together. Open label means everyone knows what they're having, okay? So as we might have discussed in the earlier session, and then also seen in the video, typically clinical trials are randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trials, which means everybody goes into the trial and some people are going to get a placebo, which means they're going to get a treatment that isn't going to do anything. Okay, and then the other group are going to get the actual drug, but nobody knows which group is going to get which. Okay, so the doctor doesn't know. This is why the pharmacy procedures are so important. The doctor doesn't know, and the patient doesn't know, and the parents don't know. Nobody knows. And that's one of the ways that you can properly establish if something's working, because if you know you're getting a drug, we know from many years and much evidence about placebos, that what happens is people who are receiving something think it's going to help them, even if they're not receiving the actual thing. Okay, mind over matter and all that kind of thing. Okay, so that's what that means. So in the case of the gene therapy trial for TAISHA, it's open label, everyone knows what they're having. Okay, dose escalation means the protocol says the first 3 patients receive a lower dose, and then patients after the third patient can receive a higher dose, but that is subject to a review from the external data review committee. Okay, so after patient 3, they will look at the data from the first 3 patients generally and say, are there any risks to increasing the dose, but also is there any benefit to increasing the dose based on the information that we have from these 3 patients? And it may be the case that they feel they don't need to increase the dose and therefore the rest of the cohort will receive the same dose, or it may be that they think we need to go up another level. That clinical trial is set to run for 63 months, which I think is about 5 years, and it's a single injection into the spinal fluid. Okay, if you want to read more information about it in detail, we're going to look at some of the basic inclusion and exclusion criteria now, okay, which I've simplified. But if you want to look at more information, it is on clinicaltrials.gov. All information about all clinical trials taking place anywhere in the world for any condition are on this website. So you can go to that link that's specific to this trial. Or you can go to the TAISHA website to read more info as well. And you can email them directly too. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. No. Yes. Okay. So this is the inclusion criteria. And I was going to break down the difference between inclusion and exclusion criteria. I think we just do it as really basic as possible to say inclusion is these are the things that you have to be in it. And exclusion criteria is things that you can't be in if you have it, if that makes sense. So they're basically the same sort of thing. So the first thing in the adults trial in Canada is that you have to have a diagnosis, a clinical diagnosis, so not the gene test, but what your doctor says looking at you, a clinical diagnosis of classic Rett syndrome, okay? And you have to have a documented MECP2 mutation. And in this case, they've also said as well, someone has to receive, someone has to have had the COVID vaccination, okay, up-to-date COVID vaccination. And again, that's basically just because if somebody has COVID and then is recovering from that while they have the gene therapy, okay, or any treatment, that could confound the effect. You might not have as much of an improvement as you would have if you hadn't had COVID or if you'd been vaccinated, okay? So that's why that's there. And there's often a lot of these little requirements involved in any clinical trial too. And in the TASTER trial, participants have to be willing to receive blood or blood products if there's an adverse event. Okay, so if there's anybody had any reasons that they weren't able to do that, they wouldn't be able to participate. Next slide, please, Wesley. So the exclusion criteria, if you had another neurodevelopmental disorder independent from Rett syndrome, so because our people with Rett syndrome, they have Rett syndrome, sure, but they can also get cancer, they can get other diseases, they're not immune from other diseases, they can get diabetes, they can get asthma, as we all know, and we're always trying to explain to our doctors. So, but in this case, if they had any other kind of disorder that is likely to make them deteriorate, they wouldn't be able to take part in the trial. Similarly, if they'd had a brain injury, so as well as having Rett syndrome, they'd, you know, fallen out of a window or had a car accident, then they wouldn't be able to take part. If they'd had an early severe kind of condition, so anything difficult that happened in the first 6 months of life, say they didn't meet any of those developmental milestones, or they'd had serious seizures and things like that, that would also exclude them from taking part. A diagnosis of atypical Rett syndrome. Okay, and this is an area that there's a lot of confusion about. So sometimes people want to have a diagnosis of atypical Rett syndrome because they think it's going to help, you know, we all like less labels and prefer our children to be more able, okay? But is it really atypical Rett syndrome, or, you know, is it just that they're doing slightly faring better because they've got a slightly better mutation, a slightly more favorable mutation? So that's something people need to think about. If it's sort of on a piece of paper somewhere that you've got atypical Rett syndrome, or you think, you know, potentially the PI, the primary investigator of the study, would look at your child and think they're not quite appropriate. But I think to give the primary investigator the opportunity to look is the best thing that you can do. I should clarify as well that with atypical Rett syndrome, there's two kinds. So there's people that are very unusually able for people with Rett syndrome, but there's also people who are unusually unwell. Okay, so it would be either of those extremes. But there's not kind of a definitive test for that, is my understanding. So I think that's something that, you know, if it's hanging in the balance for you, wait and let somebody, and you want to take part in a trial, wait and let the primary investigator look. Okay, don't go to your doctor and say, is it atypical Rett syndrome? Okay, participant has an MECP2 mutation that does not cause Rett syndrome. So sometimes there are people who have done a random 23andMe test and so on who have an MECP2 mutation, but it's not disease causing, but they may have other health problems. Unless it's causing a sort of standard level of classic Rett syndrome, you're not eligible. And then there's some more things here. So for example, that are more physical. If you're on invasive ventilatory support, you wouldn't be eligible. If you had any reason that it would be difficult to get the product into your CSF in your spine, that would be a contraindication. And we had questions last time about if people have had spinal rods, and I think there will be more detail about that that will come out as time goes by. And then, as we alluded to a little while ago, if the participant has uncontrolled seizures or you know, anything that's gone on that's been very disruptive in the last 3 months, then they would be excluded from this trial. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to look at the neurogene. So for neurogene, this is a children's clinical trial that has been approved to begin in the States. And again, I'll say we haven't had any news that they've screened or dosed the first patient. And that doesn't mean that hasn't happened, okay? Because they're not a company that tend to make a great deal of announcements, which was clear from the chart that we showed earlier. So for example, I don't think they announced that they'd submitted an application in the States. They just announced that they'd received the go-ahead, okay, for this children's trial. So they're only looking again for quite a small number. It's 5 children, girls between 4 and 10 who have, again, classic Rett syndrome. And again, it's phase 1 and 2 combined. This is going to be administered under general anesthetic, and it goes into the ventricles, which are in the head. So it involves, you know, a surgical team, basically. 5-year-long clinical trial and long-term follow-up study for 10 years. And again, you can look at the detailed inclusion and exclusion criteria on the clinicaltrials.gov website. You can also read more on the Neurogene website, and you can email them directly. Next slide, please, Wesley. So let's just try and, for the interest of time, because I do want to take questions, in terms of the inclusion criteria, again, you need to have a clinical diagnosis of classic Rett syndrome, but you also need the MECP2 mutation. You need that same stable drug regimen. And in most clinical trials, it's a stable drug regimen in all your drugs, okay, not just in your anti-epileptic drugs. And so you'd be looking at trying to remain stable, i.e. not even going up and down on doses for a set period before you were able to take part in a trial. And on the inclusion criteria here, it specifies that the participant and caregiver have to reside within a 2-hour drive of the study center for 3 months following treatment. And I'm pretty sure that's also the case in the Taysha trial, but it wasn't listed on the inclusion criteria that I'd pulled up. Okay. This is a part that I thought was interesting and might be interesting to you, is that part of the exclusion criteria for this trial is normal or near normal hand function. And presumably that's because that will be one of the specific measures that they will be looking at. Okay, before the treatment, was the person able to pick up and hold something for 10 seconds? No. Okay, if they can after the treatment, then that clearly shows an improvement. Just putting it as simply as possible. If the person has a current clinically significant condition other than Rett, again, that's typical for a clinical trial, any clinical trial. If they have another condition that somehow stops the access to the site that they need to put the gene therapy in this case, it's the head, as we've said, in the ventricles. So if there's any reason that you wouldn't be able to get into the ventricles to put that in, if there's any reason you couldn't have anesthetic, okay, then you wouldn't be able to participate. Same as the Taysha trial, they are excluding anyone that's had abnormal development before they were 6 months old, which is not typical in Rett syndrome. As we know, most people with Rett syndrome will be developing fairly normally in the first 6 months, if not a bit longer. And then if you have any other history of disorders or any other things that have happened to you that affect your central nervous system, then you would be excluded from taking part. Next slide, please. So I've given you a lot of information, so I think it's helpful to just put the two programs next to each other and say, these are the main differences between them. Okay, so we've got Taysha taking part in Canada. Trial is happening in Canada, is already underway. The US trial has been approved. It's not yet on clinicaltrials.gov, so we don't have much information about that at all. The UK children's trial application was submitted. We hope to hear about that before Christmas. They are only looking for a small number of patients in all locations. It's going into the spine. It's comprised of their own regulatory mechanism and the mini gene that was developed by Professor Bird. The Neurogene product, the US pediatric, that should say, oh, it does, pediatric trial approved in the US, patients 5 to 10. I might have said 4 to 10 earlier. I think it is 4 to 10, you know, but we will have to clarify that in the video as we put the video out after this. We don't have any information available about trials outside the US at this time, but they have said that they're working with regulators in other countries to be able to see if they can make applications there. Again, they need a small number of patients. This is going directly into the brain, okay, and it's a full-length gene. And this work was developed in collaboration with Stuart Cobb, who most Rett people will know is from the University of Edinburgh. Okay, next slide, please, Wesley. So the next milestones to look for, I think the thing about all this good stuff that's happening is it can be easy for us to, as families, to get ahead of ourselves and kind of say, right, well, when do we think this is going to be something that my child can access? When do we think it will start to go through approval processes? If this happens, then this happens, then when realistically can I expect to have it for my child? And I'm also do this in my own head. But what I've decided is most helpful for me is to try and just go, okay, what's the next stepping stone that we have to get to? And we've started to do in our Reverse Rett Matters newsletter, milestones, next things to look for, to check off every quarter when we put that magazine out. And so if you sign up for that and you get that magazine, and you can look for, okay, these are the next things to look for. The next things to look for at this point in time are that US TASIA trial for children going on the clinicaltrials.gov website, which means, you know, things are all of the kind of bureaucratic processes that need to happen, and contracting with hospitals and ethics. That's something else that we haven't even really touched on today. All of those things are in place and or starting to come into fruition. We're looking for the MHRA response to the UK clinical trial application. I feel certain, and I actually asked TASIA this as well, will they announce that? And they said they're pretty sure they will. So it's just about the timing for them for other different reasons. So we're looking for that, hopefully this side of Christmas. We are looking for an update on patient number 2 from the adults trial, and we may not receive the same kind of level of information as received for patient 1. It may be more conservative, but that's fine. The main thing is that there's no serious adverse events, which means things can keep moving forward. Once patient 2 is 4 weeks post-dosing, there is another review by that independent data review committee where they say, you know, what's the side effects? What's the positive response? Are we happy to go ahead with patient 3? And then the company will get that approval to go ahead with patient 3. And we might get some information about patient 3 being dosed. And then the next thing after that would be how those first 3 have done and whether or not we can move to the higher dose or whether that's not necessary. But that, I think, is a little bit further ahead. Okay, and then for Neurogene, we're looking for a report of the dosing of the first in-human US pediatric patient. So that will be the first time the Neurogene product has been into a person, and in this case it will be a child. We don't know whether or not they will announce that. They may not. They may wait till they've dosed a few people. We don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. Again, I'm really hopeful that might happen this side of Christmas, but we will. That's my personal hope and wish. Okay, next. I would like to emphasize to everybody on this call that it's really important, if you are looking after someone with Rett syndrome, please sign them up to Rett Registry UK. I know there's a lot of, looked at the list of people attending or who've asked for the video from this call, and there's a lot of people in Europe. Please also sign up. The only way that we can impress upon companies that people need treatment for Rett syndrome and where they are is if you're registered. This registry has been our greatest asset in terms of advocating for clinical trials of new treatments to come to the UK. And it will be a powerful asset in driving these treatments through the regulators and payers if they are shown to be effective, okay? And these are potentially life-changing treatments for a lot of people who are obviously in desperate need of them. So we need to show the regulators that we are accounting for the population that we have in the UK at the moment, where we're not doing. So please help us, and please sign up yourself, and also please share the registry with anyone you know who has a person with Rett syndrome in their family. It's very easy to sign up. It will help us do what we do, and it takes 2 minutes to sign up for, and it's completely confidential. So please, please do sign up. And I will now hand over to Catherine for questions. I'm sorry, I've only left 5 minutes. I blame Wesley because of that slide fluff. Okay, go.
Oh, Wesley. Thank you, Rachel. That was really informative. And even though I work with the organisation, even I've learned some things in that discussion. So thank you very much. Nobody's put any questions on the chat so far. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay,
Yeah, I always think if people don't ask questions, it means they were bored or they didn't understand.
Natalia, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I just wondered if we know yet in terms of the immune suppressants, do we know how long they will be taken for and after, before and after?
For the Neurogene clinical trial, or which?
Asia.
I don't think.
Whichever, I don't know if they might be similar.
That information hasn't been revealed publicly for Taysha, for children.
Oh.
I don't think. I mean, I'll have a little look again, but I don't think it has. But I'll have a look and I'll come back to you after this session. But we have, although they've submitted an application to the UK regulator for a children's trial here, we have no information about who is going to be included in that. And for only the Neurogene trial protocol is on clinicaltrials.gov. So yeah, I think I'll have to come back to you on that one.
Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm seeing shakings of the heads. I think you covered everything so well, Rachel, that you've given everybody the information that they need. So if anybody else has a question, please unmute yourself and ask.
I can see a question in the chat. So Catherine,
it just appeared. There we go.
Catherine has asked if it's possible for people outside of the UK to be in trials. And I think we did cover this in the last session. And after we put the video together for this session, we're late sending that one out. Please watch that if you haven't seen it, because that also gives some background. But the answer to that question is, I think what's expected with the gene therapy trials is that people have to live so close to the trial site for such an extended period of time that typically you wouldn't come from outside the UK. But there are other clinical trials often where people can participate if they're from another country, but I'm not sure that that's the case in these in the Taysha trial that we're expecting.
Okay. So Abigail said that she's digesting everything like the rest of us. So thank you, Abigail, for that. I think that's it. Nobody else has asked anything, and I'm not seeing any screens going live. If you do think of something afterwards, please do always email. My email is catherine@reverserett.org.uk, and we will do our best to answer it.
Slide up, Wesley. Sorry, that was on mute then. Oh yeah, that's it. And I think we could also include the slides when we send the video out so people have them.
And from me, the last thing to say is just to remember that the next bite size, oh, sorry, Cliff, will clinical trials be in various areas in the country?
So that's something that we're not able to really share information about this point, but I'll speak generally to it. The companies are always keen to have clinical trial sites spread around, whether that's, in other countries in the world, but also geographically. So we've had in the UK, we had the Anavex trial, I think took place at 5 different sites across the UK. And so they are always looking, they probably start with one site in particular and then aim to add other sites on. And it's especially important to do that because there's so much pressure on the NHS at the moment and on all the different clinics that it's difficult for any of them to take a great number of patients. And as you know from this call, there's a lot involved in putting on a gene therapy trial. So I imagine so, yes. But the other thing to say is, if people do have to relocate to live within X, distance of the trial sites, that is funded by the company. So typically, even if people have to take time off work to go and stay near the clinical trial site, that's something that the company will support a family with. And the logistical arrangements of where somebody stays and how they get there are also something that the company provides for. So there should be no barrier to people's participation if they meet all the eligibility criteria and it's something that they would like to do. I think we said in the last session that there's so many different things involved with taking part that can make somebody ineligible, that companies are really keen to look at patients from wherever in the country. Typically, they want people to have, in terms of reporting on outcomes and so on, people need to have a certain level of English, and that is a barrier that we recognise that is being worked on through various different agencies, okay? But at the moment, that's something that's there. But they will bring people, they will support people coming from far and wide, and the cost, they will bear the cost of those things, because they've got to get the right patients that meet that criteria that's been laid out by them to make sure that their studies a success and they can show, that the thing is working.
Okay. Natalia. I think you're on mute still, Natalia.
Yeah, sorry, I might be speculating there, but Rachel, is that right? I seem to think you may have mentioned that the first patient on Taisha, the adult, was released on the same day, didn't have to stay in a hospital, or did I somehow?
My understanding is that they went home. Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy, because I thought it would be a couple of days potentially having to stay, but
I wonder if maybe people are staying before because there's so many different tests that are involved and you want to
baseline measurement.
yeah, but then yeah.
Well, that's good to know. So always worries about the food, and all these hospital stays are never the most pleasant. I will stop rambling.
Well, it's definitely in the UK now. It feels like if you go into hospital, they want you to be out of there as quickly as possible if you've got things.
Out you go, gin for a minute. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So as I said earlier, the next bite-sized session is November the 16th. Now that is already on Eventbrite, so you can literally finish this call and go and get logged straight in if you want to come to that. Dan Lamsden from the Evelyn Clinic will be the guest speaker at that event. The last thing for me to say is, if you want to follow everything that we're doing, everything that we're talking about, the quarterly Rett Matters newsletter, you just need to go onto the website and sign up for it, and a electronic or a hard copy will be posted out to you. And there's lots of information in it. It's not just about what's happening in the world of science, it's what people are doing for Reverse Rett for funding, all the crazy antics we get up to, and lots of other information. So if you don't already receive a copy of that, then do go on and register. And that's pretty much it from us today. We've actually managed to keep under the hour, which is really good. Well done, Rach. And lastly, thank you to everybody who's taken the time to come and join this session today.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.